Hi, BookTube. I don't think I want to say anything more because the sun is out. The sun is out. and I can just wear a t-shirt. I don't have to wear like a couple of other layers on top of that just to keep warm while I film. So I'm just going to say hi, welcome. It's another Middlemarch meditation. Black eyes. You have left, you say, blue eyes fail to draw you, yet you seem more rapt today than of old we saw you. Oh, I track the fairest fair through new haunts of pleasure, footprints here and echoes there guide me to my treasure. Lo, she turns, immortal youth wrought to mortal stature, fresh as starlight's aged truth, many named nature. Before I say anything else, I'm going to put a health warning or an advisory on this meditation. I would not take my opinion on poetry seriously. I really wouldn't. I don't read a great deal of poetry. I tried to write it way back in the dark mists of time. And there you see, now you can just tell if I'm coming out with dark mists of time, what kind of poet I might have been. Not that great. Not that great. So I was going to give an opinion of this poem, but I'm not. I just thought I will read it and then I will leave it alone because there are people on BookTube who are better judges than I am. All I am going to do is talk and summarize what the poem is saying. The first verse is a third person speaking and saying to the person who speaks the second and third stanzas, blue eyes and black eyes no longer draw you, and the implication is these are the blue eyes and black eyes belonging to females, but they're saying you're different somehow. You're a little bit more rapt, a little bit more lost. So, has something changed? And the first person speaker in verses 2 and 3 comes through and says, yes, I've got a new love, someone that I'm searching for. I see signs of them here and there, and I go after them. And this new lover is nature. And Eliot uses this poem, she's using it to describe Lidget. Or is she? Because Lidget, it is true that he does fall in love with a branch of natural science, the study of the human body, and that's what we'll look into. But he's not a perfect man. Nobody in Middlemarch is. I think that's what Rosemary Ashton's biography is showing me about Eliot, is her strength at creating characters where no one is really perfect, and yet you have affection for all these imperfect people. Adam Roberts, the fellow who wrote the book all about the epigraphs in Middlemarch, has something to say about this particular one, which is fantastic. And don't worry, there will be a link in my description box to that book. The whole book is available online for free. So if you are really into Middlemarch at the moment and you'd like to know more about the epigraphs, his is the work to turn to. I am reading you from page 53 of the book. Here I am on page 53 of Robert's book, and he's saying the poem is Eliot's. Yay, we know that, okay? But the trope on which it is based, the choice faced by a male narrator between the intensity of a queenly, black-eyed lover and the calmer English rose represented by blue eyes, it appears enough times in 18th and 19th century popular verse to render it almost a commonplace. I did not know that. Take, for instance, Alaric Watts' The Bachelor's Dilemma, a poem written in 1823. In this poem, the narrator is torn between loving Fanny, who, quote, whose form, like the willow so slender and lithe, has 1,000 wild motions of lightness and grace, and her sister Helen, quote, more stately of gesture and mien, whose beauty a world of dark ringlets enshrouds with a regal black eye and the step of a queen. Very different. And then Roberts goes on to quote the ending of the poem, which I'll read. And when sorrow and joy are so blended together, that to weep I'm unwilling, to smile I'm as loath, when the beam may be kicked by the weight of a feather, I would fain keep it even by wedding them both. But since I must fix on black eyes or blue, quickly make up my mind twixt a grace and a muse. Prithee, Venus, instruct me that course to pursue, which even Paris himself had been puzzled to choose. And Roberts goes on to say, when he's explaining this poem, the twist at the end is that the man asks for the hand of first one, then the other, and both turn him down. Interesting. So I don't know if that will impact on the rest of Lidgett's story in Middlemarch, but it is just interesting to know that this poem is saying, that there's this black eyes and blue eyes thing going on. And so you have to say, Lidgett's expressed love for science, will it win out over the attractions that come from other quarters? So with that, it seems appropriate now to just get straight into the prose section of the chapter. And I feel on better ground to comment about the prose, because I've done more prose. And I would call, just in case anybody's been reading this chapter and thinking, I would call the prose in this chapter ponderous. Yeah, a little very heavy. And to demonstrate that, that's why I'm going to put this picture of the text up on screen right now, where you can see the exercise that I did just to break down how ponderously does this chapter begin. Just look at the first sentence, right? You can see in the margin there, I've been keeping the balance of the word count line by line. And I do not get to a full stop in that first paragraph until we have read 93 words. Yeah. And then it doesn't seem as though we stop again much. I think there's one more full stop. So I think there's 3 sentences in this paragraph altogether. No, 4. But we end up with 205 words in the first 2 paragraphs, which aren't talking about the actual subject of the chapter, but they're a little preamble to the subject of the chapter. 205 words. The first sentence, remember, 93 words with 7 clauses and 6 commas. That's an outlandishly long sentence. And I know the 19th century and the 18th century, there was a great deal of value put on these well-constructed longer sentences. And I do feel that there's almost this split in fiction admiration between admiring the clever of the author and admiring that ability that some authors have to be clever almost invisibly, because you open the book, you sink into the story with its characters and its suspense, and you forget that there's an actual human being that once wrote these words down on paper or typed them into their word processor. You lose that sense of it happening because you feel like you've simply entered an alternative reality. And Eliot, she seems to go back and forth, because you do get moments where you feel in an alternative reality with her characters. There's no doubt about it. But then there are times like this, these first 2 paragraphs of chapter 15, where you really feel like asking Eliot, who exactly did you need to impress here? And did it work out? Did you do what you wanted? Did someone write about these first 2 paragraphs and go, wow, in some fashion, in a 19th century fashion? If so, great, she'll be happy. But I can understand readers out there, if you went through these first 2 paragraphs and you thought, oh, and you kind of sighed and wondered whether you'd picked up the wrong book. And you see also the words I've circled in red, right? Great, colossi, huge, glories, copious, especially, successive, lusty. These words, they're all referring to size or capacity or greatness or fulsomeness in some fashion or another. But let's get through this paragraph anyway. There is a little something in it. A great historian, as he insisted on calling himself, who had the happiness to be dead 120 years ago, and so to take his place among the colossi, whose huge legs are living pettiness, is observed to walk under, glories in his copious remarks and digressions as the least imitable part of his work, and especially in those initial chapters to the successive books of his history, where he seems to bring his armchair to the proscenium and chat with us in all the lusty ease of his fine English. But Fielding, lived when the days were longer, for time, like money, is measured by our needs. When summer afternoons were spacious, and the clock ticked slowly in the winter evenings, we belated historians must not linger after his example, and if we did so, it is probable that our chat would be thin and eager, as if delivered from a camp stool in a parrot house. I at least have so much to do in unraveling certain human lots and seeing how they were woven and interwoven that all the light I can command must be concentrated on this particular web and not dispersed over that tempting range of relevancies called the universe. Yeah, what on earth was that? Well, it's clear that when she says a great historian, and then in the second sentence, but Fielding, that she must be referring to Henry Fielding. There is no Fielding I was able to find who was, strictly speaking, a historian, and Henry Fielding was not. He was a novelist. He worked in law, but he also wrote a bit of fiction, and he wrote The History of Tom Jones, which is a comic novel in 3 volumes. And yes, it is true that Fielding had a characteristic way of opening his chapters with something like a comic monologue. The difference being, because I went to Project Gutenberg, I read Tom Jones so long ago, I honestly could not remember. So I went to Project Gutenberg, opened the file, read the preamble to the first chapter, laughed a lot, laughed out loud, even though this was mid-18th century writing. Not laughed, it was funny. And if Eliot here is trying to imitate him at all, then I agree with her when she says that her chat sounds thin and eager and a little bit more like someone with a camp stool in a parrot house. It's not as good. And perhaps that's what she's trying to say. She's trying to compliment Fielding and saying, I could never compare with that particular kind of writing. Which makes me ask, what on earth are you doing it for? I wish she were here. Perhaps we would, I don't know if we would have arguments. What I'm seeing in Rosemary Ashton's biography is how sensitive Eliot was to any criticism at all of her writing. So I imagine if we had a discussion, it would get cut off at this point, because I would be laughing a little bit and saying, I really don't know why you wrote these 2 paragraphs, except to impress people who've read Fielding, and that would have been many in her day, to impress them at your little attempt at being Fielding, except not. So, shrug. The only thing I can say to readers who are feeling a little bit tired is, if a 21st century literary agent were to read this opening chapter, I think they would say that the start of the chapter really should be the first sentence of the 3rd paragraph, when she gets down to exactly why she started this chapter. And that, I propose, is where tired people should start the chapter. And yet, see, I can't say anything bad about Eliot without going, and yet, there are little pearls of wisdom in the pages that we're going to read. Little pearls of wisdom, they just drop down there, and they are very applicable, I think, to all of us who, particularly those of us who do booktube content, who decided we want to get on YouTube and we want to put our face out there and we want to talk about books. And I love, in particular, this phrase that she says, for time, like money, is measured by our needs. The implication being, if we need more time than we feel we have, or more money, oddly enough, that there will never quite be enough of it. The more we need it, the less we seem to have. And the less we need it, the more we have. It's some kind of awful Murphy's Law. And for those of us doing content, we're always trying to manage our time. I'm sure, I don't think there's anybody out there who just has loads of time and never has any difficulty making booktube content, because it's always a sacrifice. You have to do something. Even if you only film and put it out there, you don't edit. Nevertheless, you still have to pause what you're doing and think to some degree of what am I going to say here, and say it, and then post that video, and then get on with reading something else so you've got something else to say. It's kind of a self-driving engine. And I liked that phrase. It almost is like saying, look, you always will find it tricky to get the time that you need, but do your best. Just do your best, work it out however you can. No magic thing will ever come along and suddenly you'll just have oodles of time for everything that you want to do. And so let us go on and begin at the tired reader's beginning point, at the bottom of page 141. At present, I have to make the new settler Lydgate better known to anyone interested in him than he could possibly be, even to those who had seen the most of him since his arrival in Middlemarch. For surely all must admit that a man may be puffed and belauded, envied, ridiculed, counted upon as a tool, and fallen in love with, or at least selected as a future husband, and yet remain virtually unknown, known merely as a cluster of signs for his neighbours' false suppositions. There was a general impression, however, that Lydgate was not altogether a common country doctor. And in Middlemarch at that time, such an impression was significant of great things being expected from him. For everybody's family doctor was remarkably clever and was understood to have immeasurable skill in the management and training of the most skittish or vicious diseases. The evidence of his cleverness was of the higher intuitive order, lying in his lady patient's immovable conviction, and was unassailable by any objection, except that their intuitions were opposed by the others, equally strong, each lady who saw medical truth in wrench and the strengthening treatment, regarding Toller and the lowering system as medical perdition. For the heroic times of copious bleeding and blistering had not yet departed, still less the times of thorough-going theory, when disease in general was called by some bad name and treated accordingly without shilly-shally, as if, for example, it were to be called insurrection, which must not be fired on with blank cartridge but have its blood drawn at once. The strengtheners and the lowerers were all clever men, in somebody's opinion, which is really as much as can be said for any living talents. There is so much to unpack in those paragraphs. First of all, at the top of page 142, where you can see I've gone all multicolored. Every phrase that I have underlined, I feel is describing in particular the way Lydgate has been regarded by certain people in Middlemarch already. And I think this is deliberate on Eliot's part. For example, the puffed and belauded, well, I think that's come from Lady Chetham, who's very, very impressed with Lydgate and is probably telling everyone so because he agreed with her about her very peculiar constitution. And then envied, well, no doubt the other Middlemarch doctors are concerned by a newcomer, especially one that has been to Paris, and Mr. Brooke is backing in some way, or at least seemed to have helped him to get his place in Middlemarch. That's concerning. Ridiculed. Well, Featherstone doesn't seem in love with the man. I mean, Featherstone's not really in love with anybody, but he's not in love with Lydgate. He has ridiculed him. Then counted upon as a tool, well, Bulstrode. Quite clearly, their meeting made it clear that Bulstrode sees Lydgate as someone he can use for whatever his purposes are. And finally, fallen in love with, or at least selected as a future husband. Oh, well, that's as obvious. That's Rosamund Vincy. So I think it's interesting. She's just talking about the impressions that other people have had, and yet she's going to try to go deeper. This narrator is going to try to take us, the reader, privileged that we are, a little deeper into who Lydgate is. And then she goes on to talk about the characteristics of a common country doctor. And I'm reminded again in Middlemarch Meditation 25, when I looked into the nature of medical practice before it was reformed in the 1830s and 1840s. The common country doctor is a particular status of medical person, right? It's not just describing anybody who is medical. In England at the time, there were 3 strata of medical skilled, we could use in air quotes. I won't this time because I'm holding a book. It's difficult. I like how the narrator talks about illness as something that these common country doctors would manage and train because they are skittish and vicious diseases, as if diseases were animals, as if there was something agricultural about the way one deals with illness. And then there's this bit of humor which says that the evidence of a doctor's cleverness was of the higher intuitive order, lying in his lady patient's immovable conviction. And we have seen that earlier in Middlemarch, that really what makes a doctor popular seems to be the opinion of the well-off ladies who can afford the doctor's services. And of course, each woman vies with another. They all have their favorite doctors. And of course, it says that heroic times, and heroic is used deliberately because this is still known as the age of heroic medicine, where treatments involved bleeding and blistering, as she says, things that were really difficult for the patient, sometimes worse than the symptoms they were suffering. And I love the political comparison of illness with insurrection, which must not be fired on with blank cartridge, but have its blood drawn at once. Very conservative view. And then there's another one of these little pearls of wisdom that drops in. The strengtheners and the lowerers were all clever men in somebody's opinion, which is really as much as can be said for any living talents. And I don't know, that spoke to me again to us, and when I say us, I mean BookTube creators, that we are all putting out our individual material, whatever it is. And somewhere out there, there's someone who loves our material. And also out there are people who go, ooh, what is this? No. And, they close the video and they go watch something else. And it's learning to live with that, to be at peace with that. And that can be hard. I was listening to, you can tell I've been listening to Nick at Dr. Cranky Pants in his last video, where he was talking about what is it that I'm doing this for? What is this channel for? And yeah, it's difficult. If you want to monetize a channel, then you do really have to worry about all these people who don't watch your stuff, or they don't watch it long enough, or whatever. And I know he was talking about, the worry of subscription count. How much do you worry about it? Because it kind of goes up and down. And when you have little numbers like me, it's like one person leaves, you notice, because there's not many there in the first place. And yeah, I've watched that up and down, and I've just sort of thought, you know what? I don't watch it so much now. I think I watched it more in the early days of the channel. Now I will let 1-2 weeks go by without really looking at subscriber numbers, because there's no point. There's just no point, unless you really, really, really want to chase those numbers. But I think you chase those numbers, and there's going to be another pearl of wisdom just a little bit further on in this chapter that I think relates to that. I think you do have to make a choice. Are you chasing those numbers or are you not? Because if you don't chase them, you can do whatever you want in the way you want. You are 100% free agent on YouTube. Chase the numbers, and then that changes. But it's time we read on and didn't get caught in all these diversions. Nobody's imagination had gone so far as to conjecture that Mr. Lidgett could know as much as Dr. Sprague and Dr. Minchin, the 2 physicians, who alone could offer any hope when danger was extreme, and when the smallest hope was worth a guinea. Still, I repeat, there was a general impression that Lidgett was something rather more uncommon than any general practitioner in Middlemarch, and this was true. He was but 27, an age at which many men are not quite common, at which they are hopeful of achievement, resolute in avoidance, thinking that mammon shall never put a bit in their mouths and get astride their backs, but rather that mammon, if they have anything to do with him, will draw their chariot. Okay, and that's the next pearl of wisdom, which kind of relates to what I was saying earlier. Everybody comes, I think, to the business of BookTube thinking, I will make money doing what I want. But I think this principle says, if you want money, then money will drive you. If you don't want money, then you can drive what you do, but you won't have money. Or you'll have to get your money from somewhere else. That is, and I still think that's a cool little pearl of wisdom. It's something to remember, that whenever you embark on something new, whatever it is, you have to ask yourself, am I doing this for the money? Because if so, it's likely that your choices will not be yours to one degree or another, and usually more not yours than yours. If you're not going to do something for money, then the question is, do you need to do something else that does make money? And it's very important, I think, to find a space in your life, wherever it is, where you are as much as possible the one in charge. Because I think if no one has an activity like that in their life, where if everything they do is dancing to somebody else's tune, you can get really weary of that and you can burn out. And I do wonder sometimes if burnout, especially here on BookTube, just the result of people not realizing, thinking they're doing what they want, but actually they get caught up in the pressure to do things other people want them to do. And then before you know it, they're all worn out and they think, why? Because maybe they've drifted away just that little bit too much from what they really, really love to do. And they don't have anything else that is really doing for them that function of giving them an outlet for what they really want to do. I am digressing. I will get back to Middlemarch right now. And we'll get right back by talking about medical history. Just a recap for everybody. You can go back to Middlemarch 25, and I will say some of this again, but it's a bit mixed up with everything else. So we're going to talk about the state of medical training and practice in England in the 1830s, right? Point notes. Here we go. There was no consistent higher education qualification in any aspect of medicine, okay? There was no medical degree or any kind of degree. You couldn't become specialized in something and become a surgeon. Everything that you wanted to be as a medical person, you had to learn by apprenticing with someone already doing it. There was no single accredited medical association. There was no registration of qualified doctors until 1858. So in other words, anybody could call themselves a doctor. You would have to rely on you'd have to rely on knowing who they apprenticed with to find out whether their skills were trustworthy or no. There was no accredited medical publication. The Lancet, which is now one of the most recognized medical publications, was not started until 1823 by Thomas Wakeley, and he was regarded as a radical. So in its early days, it was not what the Lancet is now, which is a respected medical journal. And the practice of medicine in England was divided up not according to logical specialities, but by social class. So at the highest level, in terms of medical practice, you had physicians, and that was mentioned, wasn't it? Dr. Sprague and Dr. Minchin were physicians, and of course nobody assumed that Dr. Lidgett would be up that high because he was only a common country doctor. What on earth are they talking about? What they mean is physicians were always men from the upper classes who had had a classical university education, not a medical education. There was no such thing. There wasn't even such a thing, not in the 1820s and 30s, as a scientific education of any kind. That was still becoming. That was in a state of becoming. So these physicians, they acted merely in a consultative manner. They had theories. They didn't dispense medicine, and they certainly did not touch surgical instruments or perform any kind of treatment where they needed to use their hands, because work with hands was not what an upper-class gentleman was meant to be doing. So the second category then, underneath the physicians, was the surgeon, or what could be called the common country doctor. And these men came more from the middle classes, and they would be the ones that might administer treatments like the bleedings and the blisterings and all the other horrible things that are talked about in Middlemarch as medical treatments, all the other sort of cupping and all that weird stuff that, phrenology, that kind of thing. Actually, phrenology probably would have been more the domain of the physician because it was very theoretical, but maybe a surgeon would be the one that had to measure your head because, again, that was handwork. And then finally, the apothecaries. Now, these would be lower middle class because they were effectively in commerce and trade. They were selling drugs, dispensing drugs, measuring them out, packing them up, selling them to you. And some of them had a little bit of skill and could do certain medical treatments, but not very much. So that's how medicine was divided, not on any rational basis, but purely on a socio-economic basis. And medical reforms were beginning in the 1830s, and they were seeking to make medicine more based in science as it was emerging. Lidgett is going to be a demonstration of this by the treatment choices that he makes. And in fact, George Eliot's research to create Lidgett was so well done that doctors who read Middlemarch congratulated her for her accuracy. But it was really slow progress. Medical reform, the knowledge of the existence of bacteria, for example, and its relationship to disease did not exist before the 1840s. Literally nothing. So if you watched Meditation number 25, you'll remember that surgical instruments were not sterilized before the 1840s. Nobody realized they needed to be. And I'm also going to link to an article by Patrick J. McCarthy in Studies of English Literature. It's an article from 1970 about the creation of Lidgett as a character and all the research that Eliot had to do to make him realistic. Okay. We carry on with the text. Here we go. He had been left an orphan when he was fresh from a public school. His father, a military man, had made but little provision for 3 children, and when the boy Tertius asked to have a medical education, it seemed easier to his guardians to grant his request by apprenticing him to a country practitioner than to make any objections on the score of family dignity. He was one of the rarer lads who early get a decided bent and make up their minds that there is something particular in life which they would like to do for its own sake and not because their fathers did it. Most of us who turn to any subject we love remember some morning or evening hour when we got on a high stool to reach down an untried volume, or sat with parted lips listening to a new talker, or for very lack of books began to listen to the voices within as the first traceable beginning of our love. Something of that sort happened to Lidgett. He was a quick fellow, and when hot from play, would toss himself in a corner, and in 5 minutes would be deep in any sort of book that he could lay his hands on. If it were Rasselas or Gulliver, so much the better, but Bailey's dictionary would do, or the Bible with the Apocrypha in it. Something he must read when he was not riding the pony or running and hunting or listening to the talk of men. All this was true of him at 10 years of age. He had then read through Chrysal, or The Adventures of a Guinea, which was neither milk for babes nor any chalky mixture meant to pass for milk, and it had already occurred to him that books were stuff and that life was stupid. We need to do a little unpacking right at the top of the page. When the boy Tertius asked to have a medical education, it seemed easier to his guardians to grant his request by apprenticing him to a country practitioner than to make any objections on the score of family dignity. Here, now, is Eliot underlining the importance of socioeconomic class and the kind of medical practitioner one should become. Tertius Lidgett did come from an aristocratic family. However, because his father was a military man, I deduce that his father was probably one of the younger sons of an aristocratic family and didn't have much of an inheritance, had to make his living in the army or the navy, one of the two, perhaps didn't manage his money very well. That was not unheard of in soldiers. And so when he died, and he probably died in battle, he left his children without a lot of money. And the guardians therefore thought, well, we can't be fussy, because to make him a physician, which he probably should be for his socio-economic class, we'd have to send him to university. That's expensive. He's asking us for a medical education. We could put him with a country practitioner and he could become that second level, a surgeon. It's still very honorable. He'll make a good living. He'll be respected in the community, and we won't have to shell out as much money, which we don't have, to get him that education. And I also appreciate, and his choice of, he read Rasselas by Samuel Johnson, Gulliver by Jonathan Swift, but also Bailey's dictionary. This was Nathan Bailey, who wrote a dictionary looking into the origins of the meanings of English words, so that could be interesting reading as well. Or the Bible with the Apocrypha in it. It's interesting that it has to have the Apocrypha. He would have heard it at church, but he probably wouldn't have heard the Apocrypha. That kind of gets left out, so it's far more fascinating reading. But he also read a very interesting book, Chrysal, or The Adventures of a Guinea. Now, this is such an interesting book because it's a genre that existed for a short time toward the end of the 18th century and doesn't exist now, and there's probably a good reason. This is a book. Okay, get ready for it. The protagonist, the viewpoint protagonist, is a coin, is an object, not a person. So this gold guinea coin talks as if it were sentient. And it talks about it just observes where it goes and what it hears and sees, because apparently it's also given 5 senses like a person. And as it moves around, as money does, it comments on the kind of society in which it finds itself. And this started a new genre because it was such a hit, this book, when it was published. And so there were copycats, weren't there? All kinds of books written from the point of view of other objects, like, I have a lovely list here. A coat, a watch, a corkscrew, and a hackney coach. There we go. All these other books. And they were known as it fiction because the narrators were objects rather than human beings. We go on. His school studies had not much modified that opinion, the opinion that books were stuff and that life was stupid. For though he did his classics and mathematics, he was not preeminent in them. It was said of him that Lidgett could do anything he liked, but he had certainly not yet liked to do anything remarkable. He was a vigorous animal with a ready understanding, but no spark had yet kindled in him an intellectual passion. Knowledge seemed to him a very superficial affair, easily mastered. Judging from the conversation of his elders, he had apparently got already more than was necessary for mature life. Probably this was not an exceptional result of expensive teaching at that period of short-waisted coats and other fashions which have not yet recurred. But one vacation, a wet day, sent him to the small home library to hunt once more for a book which might have some freshness for him. In vain. Unless, indeed, he took down a dusty row of volumes with grey paperbacks and dingy labels, the volumes of an old cyclopedia, which he had never disturbed. It would at least be a novelty to disturb them. They were on the highest shelf, and he stood on a chair to get them down. But he opened the volume which he first took from the shelf. Somehow one is apt to read in a makeshift attitude, just where it might seem inconvenient to do so. The page he opened was under the heading of Anatomy, and the first page that drew his eyes was on the valves of the heart. He was not much acquainted with valves of any sort, but he knew that valvae were folding doors, and through this crevice came a sudden light, startling him with his first vivid notion of finely adjusted mechanism in the human frame. A liberal education had, of course, left him free to read the indecent passages in the stool classics, but beyond a general sense of secrecy and obscenity in connection with his internal structure, had left his imagination quite unbiased, so that for anything he knew, his brains lay in small bags at his temples, and he had no more thought of representing to himself how his blood circulated than how paper served instead of gold. But the moment of vocation had come, and before he got down from his chair, the world was made new to him by a presentiment of endless processes filling the vast spaces planked out of his sight by that wordy ignorance which he had supposed to be knowledge. From that hour, Lidgett felt the growth of an intellectual passion. That's where we're going to pause for this meditation, but that's because there's so much to unpack here. Lidgett is so exciting because his life story shows that there was a moment at which he found a singular passion that he could pursue. This makes him so different from Dorothea, and I'm going to go way back to chapter 1 of Middlemarch, where it describes Dorothea and the way her passions worked. It says here, she was enamored of intensity and greatness and rash in embracing whatever seemed to her to have those aspects, likely to seek martyrdom, to make retractions, and then to incur martyrdom after all in a quarter where she had not sought it. Meaning that she was a bit all over the place, back and forth, no focus, no knowledge perhaps of exactly what she might be able to focus on. Tertius Lydgate, very different. He discovers a branch of knowledge that fascinates him, and that's it. He zeroes in. And Eliot makes it so clear how Lydgate's classical education completely failed to crack open a window through to an understanding of the natural world. He only got this sense of that he was reading some things in his school classics which were indecent. And of course, if you read E.M. Forster's Morris, you soon get to know the school classics were sometimes the only way that queer young men understood or felt they found sympathetic voices that seemed to be saying or thinking things that were in their thoughts as well. And I don't have time to divert there. I would love to, because I think that's a whole subject in itself. There is a very recent book that's come out this year about the King's College, Cambridge, and what a haven it was in the early to mid 20th century for gay men who were obviously gay men of a certain socioeconomic class who could afford to go to Cambridge. But when they did, they discovered that the college was a haven, a place where you could freely be who you were, and what a revolutionary place that was at the time. But I am digressing, and I said I wouldn't. So these school classics, this classical education, didn't even give him the slightest insight into himself as a person. Whereas reading this encyclopedia and learning the heart has folding doors that open and close. And by this means, a human being is kept alive and well. And the astounding window that opened to him, the light that it shone into his mind. That's a lovely passage. And I really enjoyed reading it because what it must have been, it's hard to imagine now because science is something that we all grew up with. Nobody is old enough to remember pre-science, but Lydgate would have been. And there was all kinds of weird stuff that doctors did, and they had no proof that any of it worked. They might have a couple of anecdotes about somebody who maybe got a little bit better, but they had no way of proving that their treatments had anything to do with that. The beginnings of this must have been so exciting, and I am excited for Lydgate. But we got to leave it there because there's just so much in this chapter about his development as a young surgeon. And so I'm going to leave it and pick it up in our next meditation. Thanks everybody for listening. Sorry for all the diversions, but I couldn't help it. Nick at Dr. Cranky Pants Reads, if you're watching this, you just got me on a roll. You sent my brain off in that direction because I was reading Middlemarch, that part of it, while you were doing your latest video, and the two things they started to percolate in my brain. So you have my random thoughts for what they are worth, everyone. Anyway, midweek, we're going to do another vlog about Rosemary Ashton's biography of George Eliot. And then, of course, next Sunday, we'll keep going with this chapter. So we should finish it. And it's a good thing that we did this now in Middlemarch, March, because it's such heavy writing. Anyway, in the meantime, all of you have good reading, have good content making, and whatever you decide to do with that content, power to you. I shall see you in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.